Welcome to In the Know with the Stafford SO, a podcast presented by the Stafford County Sheriff's Office in Virginia that brings you the stories of the men and women who work tirelessly to keep our community safe each day. With In the Know with the Stafford SO, you'll find out what life is really like behind the law enforcement badge. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.
Hello and welcome to In the Know with the Stafford SO. I am Kathy Volbrecht, your host for today. Thank you for tuning in. My guest today is Deputy Erin West. Deputy West was recently certified as a drug recognition expert. When did you start working here?
I started working here approximately 3 years ago.
Okay. And you're on patrol?
Yes.
In the field, okay.
So I've spent that time in the patrol division. Prior to this year, I was assigned to a midnight shift, and starting January this year, switched to evening shift. But that still means majority of my time is after dark.
Okay. And had you always wanted to have a law enforcement career?
I did grow up with a big interest in it, I think largely because both of my parents retired from Alexandria Police Department.
Okay.
So I grew up in that kind of
atmosphere.
Yes, that atmosphere, and always wanted to get involved. And my parents, though they didn't have the chance to complete all the college that they'd won, so I got encouraged to do something else that they hadn't been able to do. And I ended up spending some time in other fields and decided I still wanted to come to law enforcement, so I did. Any deputy is able to make observations, and depending on the training they have, the depth of those observations may vary, and then they can testify to those observations in court. But without the title of expert, deputy cannot give an opinion in court. I say, based on all these observations from an evaluation I did of an individual, I believe this individual was under the influence of a specific category or combination of categories of drugs for this reason. And without that title of expert, I can't give that opinion. I can just give the generic, this is what I observed.
What prompted you to go for that certification?
Most of my time's been after dark on the roads, and while there are certainly impaired drivers during the day as well, there's a higher frequency of us coming in contact with them at night. So I, even early on, began coming in contact with a variety of impaired drivers. I didn't realize how prevalent impaired driving was prior to my time at the sheriff's office. And honestly, it's something that really struck me and developed a passion for getting these people off the road, because it is a danger to not just themselves, but everyone as a whole who's out there either on the roadway as another motorist, passenger, pedestrian, and being able to identify the impairment and better articulate it. So to not just get them off the road, but then also to have better prosecution in court, being able to bring more evidence in. I believe that that's a really important thing for our community. And I believe that with this certification, I'm better able to serve in that way.
The certification involved a lot more hours and more in-depth education. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yes, so every deputy will get basic field sobriety test training in their basic academy. So administering the field sobriety tests, and they'll talk a lot about alcohol impairment, and drug impairment is touched on, but there's not enough of time to go in depth in it. It's also a huge amount of information. So most training, like formal training for a deputy, then comes later in basically further education type classes. And drug recognition expert is a very high level of the drug driving impairment recognition. There are a couple steps between where you could have more basic level explanations of drug categories that is beyond the basic training. and maybe the tip of the iceberg of what DRE dives into, but without specifically getting signed up for those trainings, deputies have to go based on basic amount that they got in academy, or then also experience dealing with people on the road as they go and kind of learning to recognize certain signs and symptoms of drug use.
This is not a new program. It's been around for quite a while. You're joining, though, a very small group of only about 1% of all law enforcement officers in the nation who have that certification. So can you go into the history of the program a little bit? Because I'm curious sort of what was behind this.
In the 1970s, it actually has its roots in LA from the 1970s. Some officers started noticing they were coming across impaired drivers that either did not have a high BAC, which would be a blood alcohol content, or no BAC at all, but yet they appeared to be, under the influence of something. So they started realizing these are other substances, various drugs, and started trying to come up with a systematic way of being able to identify if somebody is under the influence of drugs rather than alcohol. It's not as simple as here blowing this and you get a number. There's a lot more complications, especially with there being 7 different drug categories that we are trained to recognize. So from the 1970s and then on, the DRE program has been developing. And in other states, it's actually very robust. There are DREs in probably every department. DREs are very prevalent in certain states, and Virginia is now more recently trying to build the program within our own state.
Did you see any change in drug driving during the pandemic? I know, there was a time when there weren't a lot of people on the roads, but during your time working, our streets here, did you see any increase or decrease in response to that?
I wouldn't really say I noticed a particular increase or decrease. It was more of a change in the patterns. So while oftentimes before the pandemic, I would come across an impaired driver who had been out drinking or using, maybe at a bar. Once the pandemic started, people were doing that at home, but then they would be driving impaired to, say, go to the store or something like that, or more often maybe coming from a friend's house rather than from public establishments. So I think it was more of a difference in the pattern of where they were coming from and where they were either drinking or using versus pre-pandemic.
Right, okay.
Not necessarily a increase or decrease.
Okay. So we talked a lot about how we can help our law enforcement officers, our deputies on the streets, combat this drug driving issue. But what about our citizens? What about our drivers out there? Because this still does seem to be a hard battle that they've got to fight.
I think it's really important for this topic to be discussed in depth during driver's ed training, and really focusing on the fact that DUI does not have to be alcohol. It can be a wide variety of substances, whether it be the hard street drugs or marijuana, which is now legal over a certain age, or even prescription medication. Mm-hmm. And I think that better education on that and focusing on DUI not just being alcohol is very important.
Do you obtain your certification at the end of July? Have you been able to use that training and the certification since then?
Yes, I've conducted 5 enforcement evaluations for incidents that occurred here in Stafford County. Some of them were cases where I identified and found that impaired driver. Other times I was coming in to aid another deputy in their investigation. There was another time when, while it would have been appropriate for a DRE evaluation based on suspected drug driving, it was unfortunately an accident, so the driver involved had to be treated for some injuries. So a full DRE evaluation was not possible, but thanks to the training, I was able to make much more in-depth evaluation as far as observations that went beyond what I would have been able to articulate otherwise, to hopefully be able to bring some justice to that situation.
Well, let me ask you this. What are your plans for your law enforcement career? Would you like to get more involved in this aspect of it?
I'd like to continue being involved in fighting the impaired driving problem that we do have, not just in this county, but it is throughout our country. Mm-hmm. Recently became an instructor for field sobriety tests, so I look forward to being able to help train deputies to be able to combat this problem. And then I have had lots of conversations since getting the certification with other deputies about, general tips to further their ability to recognize drug driving, especially with the marijuana law change. So I hope to be able to encourage other deputies to get further training, formal training, and then also hopefully we do some roll call trainings for other squads and be able to help other deputies feel more confident in their own investigations.
So if there are other law enforcement officers out there, whether here in Stafford County or another jurisdiction, what kind of training is involved with the certification that they would have to undergo?
There's a DRE preschool and then a DRE school. And then after that, the field certification. So it's the school portion is a very intense couple of weeks where you have classroom education. It goes beyond just the classroom education. There's a lot of outside studying you have to do. Basically, in order to be successful, you'll need to be studying from the time you wake up until after bedtime. And then you have a gap, typically, at least I did, between the DRE school and the field certification where you're continuing to study and prepare for the final knowledge exam. And then during the field certification week, the candidate has to perform a minimum of 12 full evaluations, and these are performed on people who are actually under the influence of drugs, and they participate in a toxicology test so that whatever categories you call for that individual are backed up by toxicology. And so then you have to have a minimum of a 75% accuracy rate during those minimum of 12 evaluations in order to then progress into the final knowledge exam itself. So there's a whole lot of studying. It's a lot of information, but if you're motivated and interested, particularly, it's something that is very important to do. And if you put your mind to it, you can complete it.
And that wraps up this episode of In the Know with the Stafford SO. Once again, thanks for joining me. Have a safe and wonderful day.
Thank you for listening to In the Know with the Stafford SO. This podcast is produced by members of the Sheriff's Office and is one more way we connect with our community. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Visit our website at staffordsheriff.com for details about our social media channels as well as events where you can meet our staff. Thank you for your support.